Section 1. The Ghost Marines of the 41st Millennium. Picture a battlefield in the 41st Millennium. The sky is the color of a bruise, choked with the chemical smoke of burning hab blocks and the distant rolling thunder of artillery that has not stopped for 3 days. Imperial Guard regiments are pressed into the mud, their lines thinning hour by hour as wave after wave of enemies crashes against their positions. A Space Marine strike force has been fighting alongside them elite warriors, engineered beyond the limits of ordinary humanity, and even they are faltering. Even they are starting to feel the weight of a battle that cannot be won. Their chaplain is dead. Their communications are cut. Their ammunition is running low. The last functioning Voxcaster crackles with nothing but static, and the enemy keeps coming and coming and coming. And then something happens that nobody can fully explain. Out of nowhere, out of the smoke and the dark, between one moment and the next, they appear. Warriors in black power armor, every surface covered in intricate etchings of bones, rib cages, human skulls, and skeletal hands reaching toward something unseen. Pale fire dances at their feet, cold and colorless as a winter moon, flickering up along the greaves and knee plates of their armor in a way that should not be possible, that defies the logic of combustion and physics in equal measure. Their helmet lenses glow with a faint, inner luminescence that has no obvious source. Their shoulder plates bear no chapter markings, no honor badges, no company numbers, no identifiers of any kind. Just more bones, more death imagery, more silence, and they are completely, absolutely silent. Not a word, not a battle cry, not a prayer whispered under the breath in those final seconds before impact. They move with a precision that goes beyond trained discipline into something that feels almost mechanical, but with an intent that is entirely, disturbingly alive. They raise their weapons, they open fire, and the things they shoot at die in ways that normal bolter rounds simply cannot produce. Enemies who should have survived a volley, who have survived 100 volleys, simply cease to be coherent. The flaming projectiles that emerge from these black-armored guns pierce cover, pierce armor, pierce flesh, as if none of it truly matters. And then they push forward, into the worst of it, into the teeth of whatever nightmare stands between the Imperium's servants and oblivion, and they fight until it is done, until the enemy breaks, until the ground is quiet, until the desperate men and women and warriors who were about to die are no longer about to die. And then, as suddenly as they came, they are gone. No teleportation flash, no drop ships, no warp signature, no explanation, just the smoke, the silence, the dead enemies, and a handful of witnesses who spend the rest of their lives trying to describe what they saw and failing, because no words quite fit. This is the Legion of the Damned. They are one of the strangest, most haunting, and most genuinely mysterious entities in the entire lore of Warhammer 40,000. In a setting that contains demon-possessed engines of war, gods who feast on mortal suffering, alien hive minds stretching across entire star systems, and undying machines that have been at war for 65 million years, the Legion of the Damned still manages to feel genuinely eerie. They occupy a space in the lore that most factions cannot quite reach, the space where awe and dread sit right next to each other, where you cannot tell if what you are looking at is salvation or horror, and where the answer might actually be both at once. So who are they? What are they? Where do they come from? And where do they go? How did a group of Space Marines end up becoming something that the Aeldari, ancient alien beings who have watched civilizations rise and fall like tides, describe as the Imperium's own daemons? Why do the most senior members of the Inquisition, people who make it their life's work to categorize and explain every possible threat to humanity, file reports on the Legion and then seal those reports behind encryption codes they themselves forget, because even they cannot decide if what they witnessed was a miracle or something to be purged? This is the full story of the Legion of the Damned. We are going to go all the way back to where it started, to a founding that was cursed from its very first moments, to a chapter of Space Marines who were forged from the fires of tragedy and kept rising from the ashes until there were no more ashes left to rise from, to a warp storm that swallowed an entire fleet and gave back something that could no longer truly be called alive. We are going to walk through every theory, every battle, every haunting eyewitness account. We are going to sit with the mystery and let it breathe, the way these stories deserve. Before we get into it, drop a comment down below and tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there right now. There is something fitting about talking about beings that exist outside normal time and space, with people watching from every corner of the globe at every hour of the day. And if you want to keep getting this kind of deep dive lore content, go ahead and subscribe. It genuinely helps, and we have a lot more of these coming. Now, let us talk about the damned. To understand the Legion, you have to understand the world that made them. The 41st Millennium is a place where hope is a rationed commodity, where humanity clings to survival with its fingernails against threats that operate on scales that individual human beings simply cannot emotionally process. 10,000 Space Marine chapters guard an empire of 1,000,000 worlds. The Emperor of Mankind sits on a golden throne on Terra, neither alive nor dead in any conventional sense. His mind stretched across the galaxy in the psychic network that allows faster-than-light navigation. The Chaos Gods wait beyond the veil of reality, patient and hungry, and endlessly creative in the ways they consume. The Tyrannid hive fleets drift in from outside the galaxy, devouring everything biological that they encounter. Into this world, the Legion of the Damned periodically appears. Not often, not on a schedule, not in response to any call or signal that anyone has ever been able to identify. They come when things are worst, when the math of survival is negative, when the equation has no solution other than defeat. They tip the scales, they leave. Nobody takes credit, nobody explains. And the Imperium, being the Imperium, files the reports and classifies the data and quietly debates in hushed rooms in the upper levels of the administratum whether what keeps saving their soldiers is something they should be grateful for or something they should be terrified of. The honest answer, in the 40th millennium, is probably both. Section 2. The Cursed Founding Born Under a Dark Star. To tell the story of the Legion of the Damned properly, you have to start long before the warp storm. You have to start with a founding. In the history of the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines, there have been many foundings, many occasions where the High Lords of Terra authorized the creation of new chapters from the genetic stock of the original 20 Space Marine legions. Some of these foundings produced legendary chapters that have endured for 10,000 years. Some produced chapters that lasted a generation before being destroyed in some corner of the galaxy that nobody was watching closely enough. And some produced chapters that are still active today, performing their duties with honor and precision, their origins long since folded into the vast institutional memory of the Imperium. And then there was the 21st founding, the one that every serious student of Adeptus Astartes history mentions with a particular kind of discomfort. The one that scholars refer to in their documentation as the cursed founding, and not, it must be said, as a colorful metaphor. The 21st founding took place during the 36th millennium, in an era already scarred by the convulsions of the Age of Apostasy, a period of such catastrophic internal collapse within the Imperium that it makes most external wars look almost manageable by comparison. The ecclesiarchy, the religious institution that governed the worship of the emperor, had been seized by a figure named Gog van Dire, who accumulated more personal power than any single individual had held since the emperor himself walked among humanity. Van Dire controlled both the religious and governmental apparatus of the Imperium simultaneously. He executed billions, purged entire planetary populations on the basis of perceived disloyalty, and remade the Imperium's internal structures in ways designed entirely to preserve his own authority. This is the world into which the 21st founding chapters were born, a world at war with itself. A world where the institutions that were supposed to ensure the quality and purity of Space Marine gene seed were distracted, underfunded, or actively compromised. The Adeptus Mechanicus, who are responsible for the stewardship and cultivation of Space Marine gene seed, had an ambitious goal for the 21st founding. They wanted to remove the genetic defects that had accumulated in various gene seed lineages over 10,000 years of use. They wanted to eliminate the black rage of the Blood Angels lineage, the tendency toward mutations in various other lineages, the subtle but accumulating errors that come from copying biological information over and over across uncountable generations of warriors. They wanted to use the 21st founding to create something new, something better, Homo sapiens novus, a new human race with the capabilities of the primarchs, encoded from the beginning rather than bolted on by genetic engineering. The goal was extraordinary. The execution was catastrophic. Later scholarship would suggest that some of the data driving these ambitious genetic modifications originated from the warp that records were uncovered, tracing the founding plans back toward influences that should never have been involved, whether that means active sabotage, accidental corruption from exposure to the Imperium, or something worse. Nobody has definitively determined. What is undeniable is the result. The chapters created during the 21st founding are disproportionately, staggeringly, almost comically unlucky. The Lamenters, Blood Angel's successors, were somehow engineered to be free of the black rage and the red thirst that afflict their parent chapter, an astonishing achievement in genetic modification, and, in exchange, they seem to have been gifted with a shadow of misfortune so dense that it functions almost like a curse made flesh. They sided with the wrong faction during the Badab War and were nearly destroyed. Then the Tyranids found them. They have been perpetually, heartbreakingly close to extinction for most of their existence. The Flame Falcons burst spontaneously into flames, following a great victory. Flames that did not harm their own bodies, but which the Inquisition decided were clear evidence of mutation and demonic taint. The Grey Knights descended on their homeworld of Lethe and almost entirely exterminated them. Those who escaped have never been heard from again. The Sons of Antaeus were engineered for physical resilience beyond even normal Space Marine standards, and they have been quietly hunted by elements of the Inquisition who find their abilities uncomfortable. The Minotaurs serve as the High Lords of Terra's private enforcement arm and have a reputation for brutality that makes other Space Marines uneasy. Their gene seed origins remain genuinely unclear despite centuries of investigation. And then there are the Firehawks. The Firehawks were the chapter that, depending on which sources you trust and how willing you are to sit with ambiguity, became the Legion of the Damned. Or they became something that is connected to the Legion of the Damned. Or they provided the raw material from which something else was made. The story is complicated, contradictory in places, and deeply, deliberately uncertain. This is a setting where the truth is often classified, and the classified documents are often wrong, and the wrong documents are often the most fascinating ones. The 21st founding carried something dark within it from the start, a shadow over every chapter it produced, a weight on every suit of armor and every chain of gene seed. Whether that darkness was the product of corruption, accident, or the natural consequence of trying to reach beyond what genetics could achieve, the result was the same. The chapters of the cursed founding were, many of them, marked for tragedy before they ever fired their first bolter round. The Firehawks were no exception. But their tragedy was not the product of internal mutation or spontaneous ignition or imperial persecution. Their tragedy came from something much simpler and much more terrible. They were just in the wrong place, at the wrong time. With the wrong warp currents and the wrong Geller field readings and the wrong luck, they jumped into the warp, and what came out the other side was no longer entirely them. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before the storm, there was the chapter. And the chapter had a history worth knowing. Section 3. Firehawks, a chapter forged in tragedy. The Firehawks were, by all accounts, exactly the kind of Space Marine chapter the Imperium needs. Fierce, loyal, deeply committed to the authority of the Emperor, relentless in their prosecution of the Emperor's enemies. They had a reputation for aggression that could sometimes tip over into a ferocity their allies found difficult to manage. But nobody who has seen what the 41st Millennium looks like from the front lines is going to criticize a Space Marine chapter for being too willing to fight. Their gene seed was supposedly derived from that of the Ultramarines, the great discipline chapter of Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch who codified the way Space Marines are organized and deployed into the Codex Astartes, the manual that has governed Space Marine doctrine for 10,000 years. The Firehawks always maintained this heritage. The Ultramarines, for their part, never acknowledged it. The gene seed samples archived on Terra showed subtle defects and variations that don't quite match what you'd expect from a clean Ultramarine lineage, and this discrepancy has fueled debates that have never been officially resolved. Make of that what you will. What is not disputed is the fire. The Firehawks incorporated flame imagery into their identity from their earliest days. It was not a late addition or a stylistic choice made in some retrospective reorganization of chapter heraldry. Fire was baked into who they were in their battle prayers, in the iconography of their armor, in the rituals that their chaplains developed and preserved and passed down through generations of battle brothers. Long before they became something wreathed in warp fire, they were already the Firehawks. Their first homeworld was a world in the Zoros system called Cousteau 11, and they established their fortress monastery there in the early centuries of their existence. It was a world with warrior traditions that the Firehawks deliberately incorporated into their chapter culture, a kind of respectful absorption of local heritage that was not uncommon among newly established chapters seeking to build a sense of identity rooted in the places they were sworn to protect. Cousteau XI did not last. During the Age of Apostasy, during the reign of Goge Vandir, and the military convulsions that shook the Imperium to its foundations, the Zoros system saw war of the kind that leaves nothing functional in its wake. The Firehawks fought during this period alongside the Black Templars, the Imperial Fists, the Soul Drinkers, and other loyal forces in the larger struggle to end Vandir's regime. They acquitted themselves with distinction. The price they paid was their homeworld. Cousteau 11 was bombarded from orbit by forces of the Fraterus Templar Vandir's fanatical religious army and rendered uninhabitable. A lesser chapter might have broken under that loss. The Firehawks did not. They grieved, in whatever way Space Marines grieve, with ceremony and silence, and the careful preservation of every scrap of history they could recover from the ruins, and then they kept fighting. Because what else is there to do when you are a Space Marine and the galaxy is still full of the Emperor's enemies? You fight. When the Age of Apostasy finally ended, when Sebastian Thor, the reformist religious leader who led the resistance against Vandir, emerged triumphant, he recognized the sacrifices the Firehawks had made. He granted them something extraordinary, the Raptorus Rex. This was a Great Crusade-era void fortress, a mobile star fort of extraordinary age and tremendous firepower. Originally built in the days when the Emperor himself was still leading humanity's expansion across the stars. It was one of the most powerful individual warships in the entire Maelstrom Zone. Sebastian Thor gave it to the Firehawks as both a home and an instrument of war. This was when the Firehawks became a fleet-based chapter. Without a homeworld, they wrapped their identity around the Raptorus Rex and the strike cruisers and escorts that formed their fleet. This actually suited their temperament well. A chapter that travels is a chapter that fights on multiple fronts, that sees war in its full variety, that never has the luxury of sitting behind fortress walls and waiting for trouble to come to them. The Firehawks went looking for trouble, which in the 41st Millennium is never a strategy that leaves you short of work. There was a second homeworld, eventually. After the Great Malagantine Purge of the late 38th Millennium, an operation in which the Firehawks played a significant role, they received Cousteau 11's replacement, a world that they tried to make into a proper base of operations. This too was eventually lost, though the details of how are less dramatic than the first. Over time, the fleet became definitively their home, and the Raptorus Rex became the closest thing to a sacred site that the chapter possessed. Now, it is worth pausing to acknowledge the Badab War, because it is one of the most significant events in the Firehawks' pre-warp history, and it shaped what came next in ways both direct and indirect. The Badab War was an internal Space Marine conflict that erupted in the early years of the 41st Millennium. At its heart was the tyrant of Badab Lugt Huron, chapter master of the Astral Claws, who had begun collecting tithe revenues from surrounding planetary systems without authorization and building a private empire within the Imperium. When the High Lords of Terra sent investigation forces, Huron's chapter opened fire on them. Other chapters aligned with Huron, some out of ideology, some out of old loyalties, some because they genuinely believed his arguments about Astartes' autonomy from civilian governance. Other chapters rallied to the loyalist cause. The Firehawks were among the first loyalists in the conflict. They were operating in the Maelstrom Zone, investigating the disappearance of Imperial fleet assets, when they came under fire from the Mantis Warriors, one of the secessionist chapters. The attack was unprovoked. The Firehawks responded with the controlled fury that was their defining characteristic and entered the war in earnest. Chapter Master Stibor Lazaric led them through the conflict. He was an old man by the standards, even of space marines, over 600 years old at the Badab War's outset, carrying the accumulation of wound damage that comes from 6 centuries of continuous combat. He was described in Imperial records as bitter and hubristic, characteristics that probably didn't help his relationships with the broader loyalist command structure. But his competence was undeniable, and his personal courage was never questioned. The war was long and costly. The Firehawks sustained casualties so severe that their effective fighting strength dropped to roughly 22% of full chapter strength by the war's 3rd year. Lazarek was pressured into withdrawing his remaining forces to prevent complete annihilation. They watched the final stages of the conflict from the sidelines until Lazarek successfully lobbied for one final, significant deployment, using the Raptorus Rex as a central component of the Angstrom blockade that helped seal off the secessionists' escape route. When the Badab War ended, the Firehawks were in a weakened state, but still functional, still loyal, still willing to fight wherever they were pointed. A chapter that had twice watched its home burn, that had fought for its gene seed's parent institution and never received acknowledgement, that had paid its prices and collected no debt in return. A chapter that, looking back, seems to have been specifically designed by fate to be emptied of everything except the will to keep going. It is worth dwelling on the institutional posture of the Firehawks in those final years before the warp jump, because it tells you something important about the warriors who would eventually become the Legion of the Damned. A chapter with their history could have become bitter, insular, mercenary in its approach to the Imperium's demands. Chapters with far less cause for resentment have grown proud and difficult. The Firehawks had watched their homeworld burn twice, had been passed over for honors they deserved, had been bled nearly to extinction in service of a cause that many of their sibling chapters simply did not show up for. They had built their entire sense of identity around a ship given to them as a consolation prize for losing everything, and they were still showing up, still answering the Administratum's calls, still the first loyalists into the Badab conflict, still willing to take casualties that left them running on a fraction of their operational capacity, still petitioning for the right to keep fighting when every rational calculation suggested sitting out the final stages. There is a specific kind of loyalty being described here that goes beyond institutional obedience. It is the loyalty of people who have decided that the thing they serve is worth serving, regardless of whether it treats them well in return. Whether you find this admirable or tragic probably says something about you, and in the context of the 41st millennium, the distinction barely matters anyway. Both readings are true. Stibor Lazarek, their aged and wounded chapter master, would have retired in most other institutions. 600 years old, his body carrying the accumulated damage of 6 centuries of war, he was described in contemporary records as bitter and combative with imperial command structures he felt had consistently undervalued his chapter. And yet, he kept fighting, kept advocating, kept pushing for his diminished chapter to be allowed to contribute to the conflicts that were shaping the Imperium's future. The Raptorus Rex, their home, their fortress, the most powerful warship in their theater of operations, was his instrument for this advocacy, deployed at critical moments as evidence that the Firehawks still had something to offer even when their manpower was devastated. There is something in Lazarek that prefigures the Legion. The refusal to yield when yielding would be the rational response. The insistence on being present at the fight, even when the cost of presence is higher than the cost of absence. The willingness to offer what remains, even when what remains is less than what was owed. In 963, M41, they were called to the Crow's World subsector to deal with a problem. Dark Eldar pirates, those nightmare raiders, from the hidden dimension of Kamara, were preying on Imperial shipping and needed to be stopped. The Firehawks were in the Piraeus system at the time, handling other business. The distance to Crow's World was approximately 120 light-years. Through the warp, navigating properly, with functioning Geller fields and a reliable navigators, the journey should have taken no more than 12 hours. They jumped. They never arrived. Section 4. The Jump into Darkness, 963. M41. There is a particular kind of horror in a disappearance without explanation, not a battle with bodies and wreckage and a clear chain of cause and effect, but simply a fleet that goes into the warp and does not come out. The Imperium is large enough, and the warp unpredictable enough, that this happens with grim regularity. Ships are delayed. Fleets emerge decades after they were expected. Navigators chart courses that look clean and encounter something that cannot be charted. In 983, M41, 20 years after the Firehawk's disappearance, the Administratum formally declared the chapter lost in the warp and presumed destroyed. This is an extraordinary thing, institutionally speaking. Space Marine chapters are not easily written off. They are investments of enormous resource and genetic material and centuries of accumulated capability. Declaring one destroyed is not a decision made lightly. When the Administratum finally made that declaration, it was accompanied by one of the most solemn rituals in the Imperium of man. The Bell of Lost Souls, the great bell on Terra that tolls for the deaths of heroes, rang 1,000 times. 1,000 deliberate strikes, one for each lost warrior of the chapter's nominal full strength. 1,000 tolling notes in the cold Terran air, each one marking the death of someone who had survived everything the galaxy had thrown at them, only to vanish between one moment and the next. And the Emperor, or whoever makes these symbolic gestures in the Emperor's name, from within the mechanisms of government that surround the Golden Throne, ordered a black candle to be lit in the Chapel of Fallen Heroes, on Terra, a single flame in the dark, burning for brothers who could not be properly mourned because their bodies were never recovered. The Firehawks were gone. The Imperium mourned them in the way it mourns with ceremony and record-keeping, and the quiet archival of one more tragedy in a history made entirely of tragedy. And then it moved on, because it always moves on, because it has to. But here is where the story turns. Here is where the record gets strange. The flight recorder of one of the lost ships identified as belonging to a vessel called the Absolute, the lead battle barge of the Firehawk's fleet, eventually found its way back to the Imperium. The exact mechanism by which this happened is itself unclear and disputed, connected in some accounts to the first confirmed sightings of the Legion of the Damned, which we will get to shortly. But when Imperial scholars and tech adepts finally decoded what that recorder contained, what they found was not the simple data record of a ship lost in turbulent warp currents. The recorder revealed what had happened in those 12 hours that were supposed to be routine. Following the warp jump from the Piraeus system, the entire Firehawk's fleet had sailed directly into a warp storm of terrific intensity. Not a pre-existing storm that could have been charted or anticipated, one that formed around them, or one that was already there and invisible to standard instruments until they were already inside it. The Geller fields that protect ships in the warp from the raw stuff of the immaterium, and the entities that inhabit it, began to fail under the pressure of the storm's fury. Ship after ship was overwhelmed, dragged into the warp's substance, destroyed in ways that produced no recoverable wreckage. The warp does not simply destroy ships, it consumes them. The immaterium is not empty space. It is a dimension of psychic energy, of emotion and thought and nightmare given form, and the things that dwell within it are ancient and hungry and profoundly, casually cruel. A ship whose Geller fields fail in the warp is a ship surrounded by entities that cannot be negotiated with, cannot be fought conventionally, and have no interest in anything the ship's inhabitants want to offer. The crew, the passengers, the Space Marines themselves, all of it, becomes material for the immaterium's endless appetite. Ship by ship, the Firehawk's fleet was taken. We can imagine, or perhaps we should not, but we will anyway, what those final hours were like for the brothers who watched their fleet disappear around them. For the Astartes watching through viewport ports as vessel after vessel flickered and went dark in the warp's impossible colors. For the navigators, whose psychic sensitivity to the immaterium made the storm something they could not simply hear or see, but feel throughout their entire consciousness, a howling pressure that no amount of training fully prepares you for. For the ordinary chapter serfs and servitors and human fleet crew who had no enhanced physiology, no psychic resistance, no power armor between them and what was hunting them. One ship survived, just one. In accounts that vary slightly depending on the source, this last remaining craft executed what is described as a daring warp exit maneuver, forcing an emergency translation back into real space rather than waiting for the storm to exhaust itself or navigating to a stable exit. Point: this is an extremely dangerous procedure under any circumstances. The warp does not like to let go. Forcing a break in the transition requires tremendous navigator skill and a fair amount of luck, and the outcome can be an exit point thousands of light years from where you intended. In this case, the surviving ship broke out of the Imperium thousands of light years off course in the galactic east, so far east in fact, that it emerged beyond the reach of the Astronomicon. The Astronomicon is the psychic beacon broadcast from Terra by the Emperor himself, amplified by thousands of psychers, that functions as the primary navigation reference point for warp travel throughout the Imperium. If you are beyond its light, you are in territory that human navigators have very limited experience charting, very limited ability to safely cross, and very limited hope of finding your way home from without a great deal of time and suffering. Of the more than 800 Space Marines who had boarded the Firehawk's fleet, approximately 200 survived. All of the chapter's neophytes, the younger initiates who had not yet completed their full transformation into Space Marines, were dead. All of the chapter's gene seed, the biological material essential for creating new Space Marines and maintaining the chapter's lineage, had been lost. Every single one of the chapter's ordinary human staff, the thousands of crew members, serfs, and support personnel who keep a fleet operational, were gone. 200 Astartes, no gene seed, no replacements. No way home that didn't require crossing the warp again, this time with minimal navigational reference points. And as they took stock of what remained to them and started planning a route back to the Imperium, they noticed something else, something that should have been the final blow. They were sick. Section 5. What came back was not what left. The warp is not simply a hazardous transit medium. It is not simply dark energy or spatial distortion or electromagnetic interference scaled up to cosmic levels. The warp is a dimension of consciousness, of meaning, of emotion, in its rawest and most overwhelming form. Extended exposure to it, particularly exposure that involves the failure of the protective fields designed to keep its influence at bay, does things to biological material that conventional medicine cannot categorize and conventional understanding cannot fully explain. Within days of their emergence into real space, the surviving Firehawks began to notice changes in their bodies. Their skin was blackening and blistering in patterns that had no relation to conventional burns or radiation damage. The flesh beneath the blistered surfaces was not simply damaged, it was beginning to putrefy while still attached to living warriors. The cellular degradation proceeded in ways that the chapter's apothecaries, trained in the most advanced medical techniques available to humanity in the 41st millennium, could not arrest or reverse. They could slow it. They could manage the pain. They could not stop it. Let us sit with that for a moment. Space Marine apothecaries are not ordinary field medics. They are trained for years in the repair and maintenance of enhanced superhuman physiology. Their gene seed management capabilities are sophisticated enough to extract viable genetic material from a warrior dead long enough that ordinary physicians would consider the body worthless. They carry instruments capable of emergency surgery under combat conditions that would be considered extraordinary even in the most advanced hospital facilities. And they were watching their brothers decay around them, and they could not stop it. The surviving brothers began to die. Not in battle, not from enemy action, just dying, slowly, their enhanced bodies losing the fight against something that should not have existed in the biological realm at all. A warp contagion, that is the best term Imperial scholars have been able to develop for it, though the name carries a clinical precision that wildly underrepresents what it actually entailed. It was not a conventional disease. It was not a bacterium or a virus or a prion or any category of pathogen that standard Imperial medical classification could accommodate. It was something that the warp had put into them during the storm, something that their bodies could not clear and could not adapt to, that simply continued its work regardless of what was done to interrupt it. Within the first months, almost half of the 200 survivors had succumbed. They navigated through strange and uncharted warp regions, making slow progress back toward Imperial space, losing brothers as they went. It took them years. The exact count is unclear, but multiple sources suggest the journey home took long enough that the surviving numbers had been dramatically reduced by the time they were once again within reach of the Astronomicon. And during those years, something else happened to those who hadn't died yet. The contagion was not simply destroying them, it was also changing them. Their psychic awareness, already heightened beyond normal Space Marine levels by the standard enhancements of their training, began increasing further as the disease progressed. They developed sensitivities to the Imperium that should not have been possible for warriors who were not librarians, not trained psychers of any kind. They could read the currents of the warp in ways that defied explanation. They could sense things beyond the veil of real space with an accuracy that went beyond any instrument or technique available to the Imperium. And their physical capabilities, paradoxically, were increasing even as their bodies visibly deteriorated. The blackened and rotting flesh grew harder, stronger. Warriors, who looked like they should barely be able to stand, were demonstrating strength and resilience that exceeded even their already extraordinary baseline, as though the disease was burning away everything incidental and leaving behind something distilled, some concentrated essence of what a Space Marine is, stripped of the vulnerable biological complexity and left as something leaner and more terrible. The surviving brothers had no replacement gene seed, no initiates, no way to recruit new members or carry on the chapter's lineage in any conventional sense. What had made them, the Firehawks, the institutional structure, the ranking system, the company organization, the honor marks, the chapter heraldry, all of it had become irrelevant in the face of what they were now. A group of dying men who could not die quickly enough, who were somewhere between life and death, and getting closer to the latter with each passing month, who were still loyal, still, through everything, still committed to the Emperor and to the Imperium they had served their entire existence. They made a decision that is, depending on your perspective, either the most inspiring thing a Space Marine chapter has ever done, or the most heartbreaking. They decided to keep fighting anyway. They stripped the chapter heraldry from their armor and repainted it black. Not as a symbol of mourning, exactly. Black as an acceptance, as an acknowledgement of what they had become. They covered every surface of that black armor with the imagery of death bones, skulls, rib cages, hands reaching into nothing. Not because they had given up on life, but because they had made peace with being whatever they were now, which was neither fully alive nor fully dead, and they were going to use that state for as long as it lasted in the service of the Emperor. They abandoned the rank structures and company organization that no longer made sense with so few of them remaining, most of their officers having been killed in the storm. They reorganized themselves, or perhaps more accurately, they stopped trying to organize themselves the way a proper Space Marine chapter is organized and simply became what they needed to be. A small group of impossibly powerful and increasingly supernatural warriors with one purpose and nothing left to lose. And then they disappeared into the galaxy. Not into the warp, not yet, but into the vast and undercharted frontier regions where the Imperium's record-keeping gets thin and its institutional attention gets sparse. They began to appear in places that needed them, at moments when the calculus of a battle had tilted past recovery, and when the battle was over, they were gone. The first accounts that would eventually be compared and categorized as sightings of the Legion of the Damned began to filter back to the Administratum. There were oddities. Reports from officers who had been in desperate situations and survived because black-armored Marines appeared from nowhere and ended the thing that was going to kill them. Reports that were missing detail, that couldn't be corroborated fully, that got filed in the lower priority categories because the individuals filing them were sometimes too shaken to write coherently, sometimes not sure enough of what they had seen to make strong claims. But the reports accumulated, and eventually, enough people who had no connection to each other and no reason to coordinate their stories were describing the same black armor, the same bone imagery, the same silent warriors with pale fire at their feet and glowing lenses in their helmets, and weapons that left ruin that ordinary weapons did not leave, to make the conclusion obvious. Something was out there. Something that looked like Space Marines and fought like Space Marines, but was not quite Space Marines. Something that appeared where the fighting was worst and worst, where Space Marines were present. Something that no Auspex scan could predict, no Vox communication could reach, no intelligence network could track. The Imperium's investigators named what they saw. They called them the Legion of the Damned, and the name stuck, because what other name fits a group of warriors who are condemned, cursed, burning away from the inside, and absolutely refuse to stop fighting until the last of them is gone? Section 6. The look of the damned armor, fire, and silence. There is a short but extraordinary piece of first-person writing in the second edition Codex Ultramarines, a brief account attributed to Varro Tigurius, the chief librarian of the Ultramarines, one of the most psychirically gifted space marines in the Imperium's history, describing the moment he first encountered the Legion of the Damned. We will come back to that specific incident in detail later, but the description he offers of what he saw is worth dwelling on, because it is one of the clearest eyewitness accounts in the lore, and because Tigurius, as a trained psyker with extraordinary perceptive abilities, is perhaps better positioned than almost anyone else to describe what these warriors actually look like in person. Their armor, he says, was colored black. Not just dark, not dark blue or very dark gray, or the kind of near black that some chapters achieve with deep pigmentation. Flat black, light-absorbing black, black that seems to eat the light around it rather than simply failing to reflect it. Some accounts describe looking at a legionary and having difficulty identifying where the edges of the figure are, because the armor creates a kind of visual void. Like looking at a silhouette that has not been backlit, that simply exists as an absence of visual information. On that black, they have drawn or etched, or the warp has imposed, depending on which theory you subscribe, to the imagery of bones, not cartoonish skulls and crossed femurs. Not simplified iconography. Detailed, anatomically specific representations of human skeletal structures, covering every plate and joint and surface of the armor. Rib cages across chest plates, vertebral columns running down the spine sections, finger bones along the gauntlets, phalanges and knuckles rendered in careful lines across the back of every armored hand, and skulls, yes, on the helmets, on the shoulder plates, on the knee guards, but rendered with a care that suggests these images matter to whoever put them there, that they are not decoration, but something closer to devotion. The shoulder plates carry flames, not the bright orange-red flames of combustion, but something cooler and stranger, something that suggests fire, in the way a dream suggests fire without quite being fire. The same pale, colorless warp fire that dances at their feet as they move, a phenomenon that Tigurius specifically notes. Fire that moves against the wind, fire that leaves no scorch marks on the ground below it, fire that produces no particular heat signature, even to psychically enhanced senses. Fire that is there in the way that thoughts are there, real, but not quite physical. The helmet lenses glow. This is a common enough feature among space marines. Many helm designs include illuminated optical systems. What is different about the Legion of the Damned is that the glow inside the lenses appears to have no specific technical source. Several accounts by Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests who managed to examine fallen or temporarily incapacitated legionaries note that the light source could not be identified within the helmet's systems, that the glow seems to originate from somewhere inside the helmet rather than from a specific emitter, which, if accurate, means it is not coming from the armor. It is coming from the warrior within it. They carry weapons that look like bolters and plasma guns and heavy weapons of recognizable Imperial manufacture. This is actually important because it suggests that whatever they have become, they are still drawing on physical technology rather than manifesting weapons from pure warp energy. The guns are real. The ammunition is real. What the ammunition does when it hits something, however, goes beyond what the technical specifications of those weapons should produce. The flaming projectiles that emerge from their guns pierce cover and armor as though these obstacles are suggestions rather than hard physical constraints. The bullets seem to follow something other than ordinary ballistic physics guided, many witnesses claim, in ways that ordinary rounds cannot be guided, finding gaps in armor that a normal shooter would not be able to identify and exploit. And then there is the silence. This is perhaps the most consistently noted aspect of all eyewitness accounts of the Legion of the Damned. They do not speak, not to each other, not to the allied forces fighting alongside them, not to the enemies they are destroying, not before the battle, not during it, not after. In conflicts that typically involve a tremendous amount of vox communication, battle cries, tactical call-outs, and the general noise of over 100 kilograms of power, armor-wearing superhuman, moving at high speed across terrain, the legionaries are completely quiet. Warriors who have fought beside them and survived describe the experience of looking to your flank and seeing a black-armored giant cutting through an enemy squad with perfect precision and complete silence as one of the more unsettling experiences of their lives. Some scholars suggest the silence is practical, that the warp contagion has affected their vocal apparatus, or that whatever they have become no longer processes communication the way living beings do. Others suggest it is deliberate, that the silence is part of how they maintain the separation between themselves and the Imperium they serve, a way of preventing any kind of relationship or dependency or recognition that might complicate what they have to do. Still others suggest something more metaphysical, that the Legion of the Damned exists in a state where the speech of living things no longer quite applies to them, that to communicate verbally would be to claim a kind of aliveness that they cannot honestly claim. Whatever the reason, the silence is absolute and documented across hundreds of years and dozens of separate encounters. They come without announcement, they fight without commentary, they leave without farewell. The only evidence of their passage is the dead, and the living who cannot quite explain what saved them. One additional feature worth noting: the Aquila, when it appears on their armor at all, is bone white. The imperial eagle, rendered in the color of old bone, bright against the light-eating black. It is there, but changed. Still loyal, still recognizable, but marked by whatever process remade the rest of them. Section 7. Sergeant, Attica, Centurius, and the Animus Malorum. Among the Legion of the Damned, there appears to be one figure who functions as something approaching a leader. Not a chapter master, not a captain, not any of the formal ranks that a proper Space Marine chapter would employ. The Legion has abandoned formal hierarchy, at least in any conventional sense. But one name appears in enough accounts and enough records to suggest that this particular warrior occupies a position different from the others. Sergeant Atticus Centurius. The rank is an old one, carried from before the warp storm. Veteran sergeant, most accounts agree, of the Firehawks. Whoever he was before the darkness took everything. Now he is the most recognizable individual among the Legion's warriors, identifiable by the fact that he carries into battle an artifact unlike anything else in the Legion's possession and unlike almost anything else documented in the Imperial arsenal. The Animus Malorum. The name translates from the Old High Gothic as something like Souls of the Damned, or perhaps more precisely, the Soul of Damnation. It is an oversized skull, clearly originating from an Astartes, given the size and the development of the cranial structures polished to a finish that witnesses describe as unnaturally smooth, with 3 metal service studs embedded in the upper cranium. The service studs are significant. In Space Marine culture, these studs are added to a warrior's own face to mark years of service, and 3 studs indicates a warrior of senior rank and long experience. The 3 studs in the skull of the Animus Malorum mark its origin as someone of significance. Imperial scholars who have examined visual records and eyewitness descriptions of the object believe, based on the studs and the size of the cranium, that the skull belonged to a Space Marine captain. Some theorize it is the skull of the Firehawks' last chapter master, or the captain of one of their companies, a warrior whose body could not survive the warp storm, but whose skull was somehow preserved and then transformed into something extraordinary by the same forces that transformed the survivors themselves. There is a darker theory, less often voiced, that the skull was taken from someone else, someone who was not a Firehawk, and that the Animus Malorum's powers were somehow bound to it afterward. This theory has fewer supporters, but it exists. When Centurius unleashes the power of the Animus Malorum in battle, its empty eye sockets blaze with light, not the pale warp fire of the Legion's ambient presence, but something brighter and more directed, something that witnesses describe as burning with intent. The artifact can literally pull the soul from a target, not kill them in the conventional sense, but take from them the psychic essence that, in the cosmology of the 41st millennium, constitutes the animating principle of a conscious being. Enemies struck by its power do not simply die. They cease in a more complete way, their existence subtracted from the present in a fashion that many witnesses find more disturbing than conventional death. But the Animus Malorum's more extraordinary capability runs in the other direction. It can take the souls it has absorbed and use them to resurrect fallen legionaries. A warrior of the Legion of the Damned, who has been destroyed, whose physical form has been broken by enemy action, can be called back by the power of the Animus Malorum to continue fighting, not as a mindless automaton or a demonic puppet, but as themselves, continuing whatever they were doing before they fell, resuming the battle as though the interruption of their death was merely a momentary inconvenience. This is one of the most extraordinary abilities documented in the Imperial record. Space Marines are already extremely difficult to kill. The Legion of the Damned, apparently, can be brought back after they succeed in being killed. This creates a particular kind of despair in their enemies, one that goes beyond tactical discouragement and touches something more fundamental about the nature of conflict. You can remove a warrior from the fight. The skull at the belt of their leader can put him back. There is also an account from the short story Animus Malorum by Laurie Goulding, suggesting that the artifact can be used for something even more unusual. It can take the soul of a Space Marine from another chapter and use that soul to recruit them into the Legion of the Damned. In the story, Centurius uses the Animus Malorum on a willing Space Marine captain, absorbing his essence and subsequently transforming him into a legionary. This is presented as a voluntary process, or at least as something requiring some kind of consent, and it has significant implications for the Legion's overall situation. Remember that all of the Legion's gene seed was lost in the warp storm. Remember that they have no initiates, no neophytes, no conventional way of producing new warriors. Their numbers can only go down, each battle takes some from them, and the warp contagion takes more, and there is no standard replacement mechanism. The Animus Malorum potentially represents how the Legion perpetuates itself at all, not through the biological processes of Space Marine recruitment and training, but through the absorption and transformation of willing warriors from other chapters, consumed and remade into something they were not born to be. This raises a question that nobody in the lore has definitively answered. Are the legionaries who were once Firehawks all gone now, replaced entirely by warriors from other chapters who have been consumed and reborn through the Animus Malorum? Or do some of the original survivors endure, their bodies continuing to decay and their power continuing to grow, sustained by the warp contagion even as it burns them? Is Centurius himself one of the originals? Or is he a successor who inherited the rank and the skull from someone who no longer exists? The Imperium does not know. The Inquisition has tried to find out. Reports filed by interrogator chaplains assigned to investigate the Legion consistently note that the warriors, on the rare occasions when they can be captured or examined at all, refuse to answer questions. Not because they cannot speak or cannot understand the questions, but because they do not answer. They simply wait. And when the moment is right, or perhaps when something only they can sense determines it is time, they are gone. Centurius himself is described across multiple sources as a warrior whose armor displays no rank insignia beyond the bone and skull imagery common to all legionaries, whose presence on a battlefield inspires something that witnesses struggle to categorize as anything other than dread, and whose tactical decisions suggest the kind of military experience you only accumulate across a very long career. Whether that career began before or during or after the warp storm is unclear. What is clear is that he is the closest thing the Legion has to a face, and his face is a skull carved from an artifact that eats souls, and somehow that is entirely appropriate. Section 8. Notable Battles and Miraculous Interventions. The documented sightings and interventions of the Legion of the Damned span centuries of Imperial history, from the period shortly after the Firehawks were declared lost, all the way through to the events of the current era. Not all of these accounts are equally well sourced. Some are battlefield testimony from soldiers who were fighting for their lives, and possibly not in the ideal mental state for rigorous observation, but enough of them are corroborated by multiple independent witnesses, post-battle auspex readings, and in some cases, examination of physical evidence to establish a consistent pattern. Let us walk through some of the most significant and well-documented ones. In 852, M41, more than a century before the warp storm that claimed the Firehawks, the Legion, was already operating. This is one of the genuinely puzzling aspects of the timeline, and one we will examine more carefully in the section on theories. At this date, the chapter known as the Invaders was conducting a devastating assault on the Aldari craft world of Idhare. Now, this is already a complicated situation from an Imperial perspective. Craft worlds are population centers of the ancient Aldari species, and attacking one is not necessarily a policy-sanctioned action, but the invaders had their reasons and their chapter master's authority to proceed. The battle was proceeding in complex ways, when the Legion of the Damned appeared. They arrived alongside the emergence of the Avatar of Kaine, the physical manifestation of the Aldari war god, a creature of molten metal and ancient psychic power that no conventional weapon should be able to stop. The Legion found this out quickly when their flaming projectiles proved unable to harm the Avatar directly. For most forces, this would represent the end of viable options. The Legion of the Damned instead targeted the architectural infrastructure of the vast dome under which the fight was taking place and deliberately caused it to catastrophically fail. This is a remarkable tactical decision that reveals something about how the Legion thinks. They are not simply following a flowchart of conventional tactics. They are willing to destroy the environment of the battle itself, willing to put themselves in the path of a collapsing dome in order to ensure that the Avatar is caught in the wreckage and the enemy's defensive position is eliminated. They, the invaders, and the remaining Eldari defenders were all blasted out into the void as the dome ruptured. The single surviving invaders' warrior later reported that the Legion vanished before he could make contact with them in the aftermath. Idhare was left a desolate ruin, its structure shattered, its population, what had been left of it, gone. In 922, M41, chief librarian, Varro Tigurius of the Ultramarines led a strike force to the world of Andraxis in response to a request from the Adeptus Mechanicus. A delegation of tech priests was stranded on the world, which had come under assault from an orc warband, the Greenskin Hordes, that function as one of the Imperium's perpetual headaches, endlessly aggressive and almost impossible to permanently eliminate, because their reproduction doesn't depend on the things you can destroy in a conventional military operation. Tigurius arrived to find the situation considerably worse than the initial intelligence had suggested. His chaplain was dead. His company was devastated. The orcs were pushing through the perimeter with the relentless physical energy that makes them so difficult to hold against. On the eve of what he was calculating as the final battle, Tigurius led his remaining brothers in prayer, a quiet, desperate act of faith from a man who spends most of his existence thinking about the future and seeing things that haven't happened yet, now in a situation where he could see exactly what was about to happen and could not change it. When he raised his head from prayer, the Legion of the Damned was there. In his own words, recorded in the Codex, their armor was colored black, covered in chilling images of bones and fire, skulls on their helms. As they advanced, an eerie glow surrounded them, and fire danced at their feet. Like the bones of men in purgatory, he said, looking more like skeletons than living men. Not a sound did they make. And they fell upon the orcs with a fury that left Tigurius with very little work to do. He regrouped his company and led them back into the fray. But there was little left to fight. The orcs lacked the stomach for whatever they had just encountered. The great bastion was secured. Of the Legion, when he looked, there was no sign. This is the account that gave the Legion of the Damned their definitive introduction in the lore of Warhammer 40,000, the description that established them as something beyond a simple special forces unit or an unusual chapter variant. Tigurius, a man who has seen things that would break most minds, who has advised chapter masters and watched hive fleets and survived the drop site massacre's psychic echoes through 10,000 years of genetic memory, described witnessing the Legion as one of the formative experiences of his long life. Also connected to this engagement, though less often discussed, is the recovery of an artifact of extraordinary significance. The Andraxis engagement resulted in the retrieval of what scholars believe may be the Force Staff of Malkador, the Sigillite Malkador, being the Emperor's closest advisor during the Horus Heresy, perhaps the most powerful human psyker who ever lived, apart from the Emperor himself. The staff reportedly contained information about the workings of the Golden Throne, how it came to be on Andraxis, and how its retrieval connects to the Legion's arrival there, is another layer of mystery that the Inquisition has presumably tried to excavate and probably found unsatisfying answers to. In 940, M41, The Iron Snakes, a chapter with strong ties to the Aegis subsector and a reputation for exceptional individual warriors, were conducting operations on a world called Thymion when they were ambushed by Tau forces. The Tau Empire is an expansionist alien civilization with an extremely efficient combined arms, military doctrine, and a particular talent for catching their opponents in prepared positions. Being ambushed by Tau while already engaged is a difficult tactical situation, the kind of problem that eats contingency plans for breakfast. The Legion of the Damned launched an assault on the Tau flank, taking the pressure off the Iron Snakes at a critical moment and allowing them to re-establish a coherent defensive line. By the time the Iron Snakes had reorganized, the Legion was gone, and their intervention was visible only in the bodies of the Tau warriors who had been on that flank. The fall of Cadia, the fortified world at the eye of the storm of chaos, the linchpin of the Imperium's defenses against the greatest concentration of chaos forces in the galaxy, produced one of the more dramatic, recorded appearances of the Legion. During the 13th Black Crusade, when Abaddon the Despoiler finally achieved what he had been attempting for 10,000 years and broke Cadia's defenses permanently, the Legion was documented fighting in multiple locations simultaneously in the chaos of the planet's final days. Imperial forces who were trying to evacuate or hold positions long enough to enable evacuations reported black armored warriors appearing and buying time that should not have been available, holding points that should not have been holdable, and then vanishing as the situation became unrecoverable. They could not save Cadia, but the accounts suggest they helped more people escape than would otherwise have managed it. The Phalanx, the ancient mobile fortress of the Imperial Fists. Chapter, one of the most formidable warships in existence, was boarded during the fall of Cadia by Chaos forces. The Legion of the Damned was documented fighting in its corridors during this crisis, appearing from nowhere in sections of the ship that had been cut off and overwhelmed, clearing those sections and disappearing before any organized response to their presence could be arranged. Each of these encounters follows the same basic pattern, a situation that appears unwinnable, the sudden appearance of silent black-armored warriors, a reversal of the tactical situation, and a disappearance that leaves no trace and no explanation. The consistency of the pattern across centuries and across encounters that have no other connecting factor, different enemies, different planets, different allied forces, different time frames, is one of the things that makes investigators so uncomfortable. There is something directing this, something that knows where to be and when to be there. Whether that something is the Legion itself, acting on their enhanced psychic awareness, or something else that is directing them, is one of the questions at the heart of every theory about what they actually are. Section 9. The theories. What are they, really? Of all the fascinating corners of the lore surrounding the Legion of the Damned, the theories about their nature are perhaps the richest. The Imperium of Man is not, as a general rule, an institution that handles ambiguity gracefully. It tends toward categorical answers, loyalist or traitor, human or mutant, blessed or tainted. The Legion of the Damned defeats every category it is placed in with the same ease it defeats its enemies. And the result is a fascinating diversity of explanations, each one coherent within its own frame of reference, each one contradicted by some aspect of the evidence. Let us go through them seriously. The most established theory, presented explicitly in the 6th edition Codex, Legion of the Damned, and supported by the flight recorder evidence described earlier, is the Firehawks theory. The Legion of the Damned are the surviving Firehawks, transformed by warp exposure into something that transcends but does not entirely abandon their original nature. This theory has the most evidentiary support. The flight recorder data is real, or at least is presented as real within the lore. The timing of the Firehawks' disappearance and the earliest documented sightings of the Legion line up, mostly. The description of the warp contagion, the blackened skin, the decaying flesh, the increasing psychic sensitivity, the growing supernatural power matches the observable characteristics of the legionaries. The problem with the Firehawks theory is the timeline. In 852, M41, more than 100 years before the Firehawks' warp jump in 963, M41, the Legion of the Damned, was already documented at the Craft World Itaray. This is not a minor discrepancy. 100 years is longer than many Space Marine careers. If the Legion existed before the Firehawks were lost, then either the early sightings are misattributed, or the Firehawks theory is fundamentally wrong, or the warp has done something genuinely unusual with the temporal sequence of events. That last option is not as absurd as it sounds in the context of the 41st millennium. The warp does not operate by the same rules that govern real space. Time in the immaterium is not linear in the way that time outside it is. Ships that enter the warp and exit it can find themselves years or decades earlier or later than their entry point would predict. It is entirely possible, and some scholars of the Imperium actively argue this, that the Firehawk's transformation in the warp resulted in something that can operate outside normal temporal sequence, that the Legion can appear before its own creation, or that their warp nature allows them to exist across multiple points in time simultaneously. This is headache-inducing to contemplate in any sustained way, but it is a feature of the setting rather than an error in the lore. The second major theory is what might be called the psychic backlash hypothesis, or, in more formal scholarly language, the theory of psychic manifestation. A few scholars of Space Marine history have proposed that the Legion of the Damned is not a group of physical beings at all, but rather a collective psychic phenomenon made real by the accumulated trauma and rage and grief of the Space Marine chapters. Specifically, the trauma of the Horus Heresy, the Istvan massacres, where tens of thousands of loyal Space Marines were killed by their former brothers in a single day, in the opening move of the greatest betrayal in human history and the death of Primarchs, and the slow poisoning of the Great Crusade's legacy, left wounds in the psychic fabric of the Space Marine chapters that 10,000 years have not fully closed. The theory holds that these wounds are so deep, so thoroughly encoded into the gene seed and the institutional memory and the collective psychic resonance of the Adeptus Astartes, that they have generated a literal manifestation, a psychic echo of all those dead and betrayed warriors, given form by the pain of every loyal Space Marine who has inherited that genetic memory. The Legion of the Damned, in this reading, is what grief looks like when grief has the psychic potential of 100 Space Marine chapters behind it. They appear specifically at moments when loyal Space Marines are about to be destroyed, because that is the exact kind of situation that resonates most strongly with the psychic wound that created them. This theory explains the silence entities formed from psychic resonance do not have voices in the conventional sense. It explains the fire warp fire is essentially solidified psychic energy given physical expression. It explains why the Legion seems to be specifically drawn to situations where Space Marines are in danger, rather than any situation where the Imperium faces threat. It has a certain terrible poetry to it as well. The idea that the Heresy's crimes have never really ended, that every loyal Space Marine who dies while their brothers are not watching is just adding more weight to a psychic manifestation of grief that has been growing for 10,000 years. The third theory is the most radical, in the technical sense that it represents the thinking of radical factions within the Inquisition rather than orthodox positions. The radical Inquisitor Quixos, a figure who represents a particular strain of imperial thought that is willing to consider conclusions that the orthodox establishment finds extremely uncomfortable, proposed that the Legion of the Damned are what happens when humanity's faith in the Emperor becomes powerful enough to generate warp entities. In the cosmology of the 40th millennium, the Chaos Gods are literally made of human emotion. They grew in the warp over millennia from the accumulated psychic output of conscious beings, fed by fear and anger and despair and pleasure. Quixos's argument is that the Emperor's worship, maintained on a scale that involves literally billions of people across 1,000,000 worlds every single day for 10,000 years, might be powerful enough to generate something similar, but loyal rather than corrupted, shaped by faith rather than by depravity. In this theory, the Legion of the Damned are functionally imperial demons entities born of the warp, shaped by the Emperor's psychic nature, deployed at moments of need as extensions of the Emperor's will. This would explain the timing of their appearances, which always seems to reflect an almost prescient awareness of where they are needed. It would explain their supernatural characteristics, the warp fire, the non-physical aspects of their combat capabilities, the ability to appear without transit and disappear without trace. And it would represent one of the more interesting theological paradoxes in a setting full of them. The Imperium spending enormous institutional energy, hunting and destroying warp entities while being quietly saved by one of its own making. This is not a view that the Inquisition officially endorses. It is the kind of view that gets a career ended if you voice it too loudly to the wrong people. But Quixos was not the only one who thought it, and the question has not been answered definitively enough for the theory to simply fade away. Then there is Quadrimesta's thesis of perpetual martyrdom, a piece of analysis that attempts to reconcile the physical reality of the Legion with the more metaphysical characteristics they display. In this framework, the surviving Firehawks have somehow merged with the warp at a molecular or metaphysical level, contracting a contagion that is not simply biological disease, but a fusion of their physical existence with the stuff of the Imperium. This fusion is destroying them, hence the visible decay, but it also grants them properties that purely physical beings cannot have. The ability to be reborn after destruction, for instance, much as a daemon banished from the real space returns to the warp and reforms over time. The ability to move through space without conventional transit. The ability to read the Emperor's Tarot, the psychic divination system used across the Imperium with uncanny precision, which is why they consistently appear exactly where they are needed at exactly the right moment. This theory suggests that the Legion exists in a state of perpetual attempted redemption. They are contaminated in some fundamental way that cannot be purged, and they know it. They cannot enter the Emperor's presence. They cannot be simply welcomed back into the Imperial fold, even if they wanted to be. What they can do is fight. They can spend every moment of their existence between destruction and rebirth in service to the Imperium that, on some level, they still are. And perhaps at some final moment, after enough enemies have been stopped, after enough loyal soldiers have been saved from deaths they couldn't survive on their own, they might achieve something that allows them rest. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the contagion is too complete, the merger with the warp too thorough. Perhaps they fight because they must, because it is the only purpose left to beings who have nothing else. There is a fourth theory, less formally articulated than the others, but present in the edges of the lore in various forms, that might be called the Emperor's Instrument theory. This view does not concern itself much with the mechanism by which the Legion operates, whether they are physical beings, warp constructs, psychic manifestations, or some fusion of all three, and focuses instead on the functional role they play. Whatever they are, and wherever they come from, they arrive at the moments of maximum imperial need, with precision that no intelligence network can explain. They address exactly the threat that needs addressing, with exactly the force required, and they vanish before they can become a complication. This is the behavior of a tool used by someone who knows exactly what they are doing. The question the theory poses is, who is the someone? The most religiously inclined answer is the Emperor himself, operating through whatever attenuated form of action is available to him from his position on the Golden Throne. This is theologically complex. The orthodox imperial position is that the Emperor cannot directly intervene in individual events, that his influence flows through the Astronomicon and through the broad currents of psychic protection he provides, rather than through specific targeted actions. But orthodoxy in the Imperium of man is frequently at war with the observed evidence, and the observed evidence suggests that something with an extraordinary strategic overview is directing these interventions. The more secular version of the same theory dispenses with the Emperor's active direction and posits instead that the Legion has somehow been tuned to respond to the same psychic frequencies that the Emperor generates, or that the warp contagion has aligned them with something in the Imperium that reflects the Emperor's will, even if it is not directly controlled by him. Like a compass that points north, not because the Emperor placed it there, but because of the field it exists within. There is a fifth framework, newer and emerging from scholars who study the effects of the psychic awakening, the period in more recent 41st Millennium history, where human psychic activity has been dramatically increasing across the galaxy, who suggest that the Legion's appearances may be becoming more frequent as a result. If one theory about their nature is correct, the collective psychic manifestation theory, or the Emperor's faith warp entity theory, then a galaxy where human psychic activity is increasing would be a galaxy where the conditions that produce or sustain the Legion are becoming more favorable. More belief, more psychic output, more raw material for whatever process generates these interventions. Whether this is cause for hope or alarm probably depends on which theory about their nature you subscribe to, and whether you think the Legion becoming more common is the universe recognizing that we are in the worst of times, or the universe preparing for something even worse than the worst of times. The Aeldari perspective is worth including. though it comes from outside the Imperium's own theoretical frameworks. The Aldari, ancient as they are, and profoundly attuned to the warp, look at the Legion of the Damned and see daemons. Not in the pejorative way humans use that term as a synonym for something to be destroyed. In the technical sense, entities shaped by belief and psychic resonance, given form in the immaterium, and crossing over into real space at need. They see the Emperor's mark on these beings, his shaping influence, the same way they can identify the marks of the Chaos Gods on other warp entities. And they treat this knowledge with the complicated combination of pragmatism and unease that characterizes most Eldari interactions with human institutions. The Legion of the Damned are not enemies of the Eldari in any direct sense, but neither are they entirely comfortable presences in the warp. They are something new, something that the universe has not quite produced before. And in the 41st millennium, things the universe has not produced before are usually either very interesting or very dangerous, and frequently both simultaneously. The 6th edition Codex, Legion of the Damned, was deliberate in not resolving any of these tensions. This was a creative choice worth acknowledging, because it would have been easy to simply declare the Firehawks theory canonical and move on. Instead, the Codex presents the Firehawks connection as one theory among several, examines each theory through the lens of scholars with different backgrounds and different methodological commitments, and leaves the reader with a mystery rather than an answer. This is, in the author's opinion, the right call. The Legion of the Damned is more interesting as a question than as an answer. The moment you define them completely, you lose something essential about what makes them haunt the imagination the way they do. Section 10. How they fight doctrine, deployment, and divine timing. There is something worth spending time on in the specific mechanics of how the Legion of the Damned operates on a battlefield, because it reveals things about their nature that theories alone cannot fully illuminate. They do not respond to distress signals. They cannot be called, contacted, invited, or summoned by any means that anyone has ever documented successfully. There is no frequency on which you can broadcast a request for assistance and receive a Legion of the Damned response. There is no ritual, no prayer, no protocol. Commanders who have been saved by the Legion generally describe having no warning of their arrival, no unusual auspex readings, no warp signatures, no preliminary indications that they were present. They simply were not there, and then they were. The Emperor's Tarot is the mechanism most frequently cited in connection with their seemingly perfect targeting of critical moments. The Emperor's Tarot is a genuine divination system in the lore of the 41st millennium, a set of cards whose use in divination is considered entirely reliable by those trained in its use, because it is believed to be connected to the psychic will of the Emperor himself. Across the Imperium, senior officials and trained tarot users regularly consult it for guidance on military and political decisions, and its accuracy is considered sufficient to act upon. The Legion of the Damned, according to sources within the Codex, uses the tarot as its primary decision-making tool for where to appear. Their heightened psychic sensitivity, a product of the warp contagion that would kill them if they were killable in a conventional sense, allows them to read the tarot with a precision that no ordinary human practitioner can match. They can identify not just that a situation will be critical, but exactly when and where the intervention will make the maximum difference between defeat and survival. This is why they always arrive at the exact worst moment of the battle, not after the fight starts going badly, not before the enemy has committed. At the exact inflection point where a small amount of additional force in the right place changes the entire equation. This precision has implications. It means the Legion is not simply running from crisis to crisis at random. Something, whether the tarot itself, or their own psychic awareness, or whatever entity might be directing them, is performing a kind of strategic calculation across the entire galaxy, identifying the moments where their intervention has maximum effect and deploying them accordingly. This is an operation of extraordinary sophistication and scope. It would require the kind of strategic picture that even the most capable human commanders and the most advanced intelligence networks in the Imperium cannot fully achieve. The Legion of the Damned apparently has this picture, or access to it, or is directed by something that does. On the battlefield itself, they function as something between an elite assault force and a force multiplier. Their weapon's ability to ignore cover makes them extraordinarily effective against enemies who have prepared defensive positions. Standard military doctrine involves establishing positions behind cover that can survive ordinary weapons fire while allowing you to engage the enemy. Against the Legion of the Damned, the cover is essentially irrelevant. The flaming projectiles find what they are aimed at, regardless of what is between the gun and the target. Enemy commanders who have successfully analyzed Legion engagements and survived to report on them note that the only viable response is to withdraw or counterattack with sufficient force to simply overwhelm the legionaries with volume, and that even this does not always work. Their durability is extraordinary. Eyewitness accounts consistently describe legionaries continuing to fight after receiving wounds that would kill any other Space Marine. Whether this is because the warp contagion has made them more resistant to physical damage, or because they are already in such a degraded state that additional damage simply doesn't have the same effect, or because their merger with the warp means that some part of them exists beyond the physical, even when the physical is failing, is unclear. The result is the same in any case. They are extremely difficult to stop. They are also, apparently, extremely difficult to capture, which has frustrated inquisitorial investigators to an extraordinary degree. Members of the Legion have been cornered, surrounded, their armor breached by weapons powerful enough to take apart conventional Space Marine ceramite, and then somehow they are not there anymore. This has been attributed to various mechanisms in various accounts, a kind of phasing in and out of reality that their warp merge state allows, or teleportation, or simple invisibility that baffles Auspex equipment. The result is the same, regardless. Captured specimens of the Legion of the Damned appear to be a theoretical category without practical examples. There is also the psychological effect of their presence on Allied forces, which should not be underestimated as a battlefield factor. The legionaries do not speak. They make no reassuring sounds. They do not communicate through conventional means. For Allied soldiers watching them fight, who have spent hours or days or weeks in a brutal engagement, who are exhausted and wounded and losing, whose commanders are dead, and whose ammunition is failing, the arrival of silent black-armored giants wreathed in cold fire is an experience that defies immediate categorization. Is this rescue? Is this something worse? Are these things on our side? Several survivor accounts note a period of confusion and near-friendly fire incidents in the opening moments of a Legion appearance, where Allied soldiers were simply unable to process what they were seeing quickly enough to avoid pointing weapons at it. The Legion, apparently, is very good at not being accidentally shot by panicked soldiers, whether this is because they anticipate the confusion and position themselves to minimize it, or because the kind of thing that can stop a Legion warrior is not in the hands of the surviving Imperial forces, is unclear. But the confusion resolves. The legionaries make it obvious, through their actions, that they are addressing the enemy rather than the Allies, and the Allied soldiers who see this happening have their morale transformed by the sight. This is the flip side of the fear. Yes, they are terrifying in appearance. Yes, the silence and the fire and the bone imagery communicate something that no sane person finds entirely comfortable. But they are terrifying in that direction, toward the enemy, and after enough time passes for the initial shock to clear, what remains in the minds of the Allied warriors is something close to awe and something that functions like renewed will. If those things are here, fighting for us, then maybe the situation is not as terminal as it appeared. Maybe there is a path through this after all. The effect on enemies is the inverse and more severe. Many accounts describe enemy forces, even elite and disciplined ones, beginning to break well before the Legion's firepower alone could account for the losses. Something about the way the legionaries move and fight and exist on the battlefield communicates a wrongness that bypasses tactical calculation and reaches something more fundamental. You can be brave in the face of bolter fire. You can hold your position when Space Marines advance on you. You have trained for that, you have drilled for it, you have chosen to be somewhere that puts those threats in front of you. You have not trained for things that should be dead and are not, that move without sound through fire that does not burn, that your weapons cannot seem to properly harm, that simply keep coming and keep reducing your formation to constituent parts, regardless of what you do about it. The psychological dimension of the Legion of the Damned's presence on a battlefield is a force multiplier that their physical capabilities alone do not fully account for. They are terrifying, and they know they are terrifying, and they use it. After the battle, they leave nothing. No casings from spent ammunition, which should be there. No blood if they were wounded, which should also be there. No tracks. No physical trace that any being weighing several hundred kilograms in power armor just moved across this ground. Investigators who arrive at battlefields where the Legion was reported to have fought find the bodies of the enemies the Legion killed, find the testimony of the allies the Legion saved, and find nothing else. No forensic evidence of their passage, as if they were always just slightly less present than a real physical being ought to be, as if they were, always, in some sense, not quite here. Section 11. The Warp Contagion, a disease unlike any other. It is worth spending dedicated time on the nature of the affliction that defines the Legion of the Damned, because it is simultaneously the source of their tragedy and the source of their power, and understanding it is essential to understanding them. Before examining the technical details of the warp contagion, it is worth pausing to simply imagine what those first months aboard that single surviving ship must have been like. 200 space marines, these engineered post-humans, who have spent their entire careers being more durable and more capable than everything around them, who have been trained from youth to process damage and continue, who carry within their bones the biological heritage of a Primarch, realizing collectively that something was wrong with them, and that the systems they trusted to address biological problems could not address this one. Apothecaries moving through the ship's corridors with their narthecium instruments, examining warriors who should have been in peak condition, finding cellular degradation that made no sense by any diagnostic framework they had been given. Warriors looking at their own skin in the dim lighting of a battle barge that had survived by the thinnest possible margin and seeing it change color, seeing the first blistering, feeling the strange combination of physical pain and something else, something that the pain was trying to communicate, that language did not quite have words for. The smell that comes with tissue that is breaking down while still attached to a living body, present in the corridors, in the common areas, in the places where these warriors ate and rested and prayed. And the prayers. Because the Firehawks were notably devout for a Space Marine chapter. They were strict adherents of the Imperial cult, believers in the Emperor's divinity, in the divine right of humanity to rule the stars. This was not common among Space Marine chapters. Many take a more secular or pragmatic approach to the theology of the Emperor's nature. The Firehawks believed, and in those dark months, drifting through warp space with insufficient navigational reference points, watching their brothers decay, they would have prayed in the ways their chapter's rituals specified, and those prayers would have been answered with continued decay and continued uncertainty, and the growing awareness that whatever had happened to them was not going to simply stop. The decision to keep fighting when it came, when it crystallized from the shared understanding of their situation into an actual course of action, must have been one of the most extraordinary collective decisions in Space Marine history. 200 men who knew they were dying, who had no gene seed and no initiates and no chapter to rebuild even if they survived long enough to try, who were beyond the reach of any support the Imperium could offer, and increasingly unsure they wanted to be found anyway. Deciding to keep fighting, deciding that the dying was going to be spent on something rather than simply spent. The warp contagion is not classified anywhere in the extensive Imperial medical literature on conventional diseases, mutations, or biological threats. It does not appear in the archives of the Adeptus Mechanicus under any standard category of genetic or cellular pathology. It does not behave the way biological diseases behave, which progress through identifiable stages and respond in predictable ways to available treatments. It appears to operate according to principles that conventional science, even the highly advanced science of the 41st millennium, cannot fully account for. What it does, physically, is destroy the surface tissue of the afflicted, while somehow reinforcing the deeper structural integrity of the warrior beneath. The blackening and blistering that begins within days of warp exposure progresses over time into a visible deterioration of the armor's organic occupant. Where the armor is damaged or removed, what is visible beneath is not healthy tissue. In some accounts, the bones of the warrior are visible through what remains of the flesh, which contributes to the Legion's appearance of living skeletons wearing powered armor. The bone imagery is not only painted on the outside of the ceramite, but sometimes literally visible through gaps and damage in it. And yet these warriors fight with strength and speed that exceeds what healthy space marines of comparable size and training can produce. The contagion is not weakening them in the conventional sense, even as it visibly decays their physical form. It is as though the biological complexity of the human body, all the systems and subsystems and feedback loops and maintenance requirements that make living tissue so fragile compared to what it could theoretically be, is being stripped away, and what remains is something leaner and more concentrated. A refined version of a space marine's capabilities, freed from the biological overhead. The psychic enhancement is consistent across all accounts. Legionaries, who should have no particular psychic sensitivity, demonstrate awareness of the warp that trained librarians spend decades developing. They can apparently navigate the Imperium in ways that standard navigators cannot, or at least can survive conditions in the warp that standard navigators would not. The Emperor's tarot reading capability suggests active psychic connection to the larger currents of the warp rather than simply passive awareness. They know things. They go where things will matter. This is not intelligence gathering or strategic analysis in any conventional sense. It is something more direct. The progression of the disease also has an end state, and it is one that some accounts describe in terms that suggest it is not simply death. When the contagion reaches its final stages, whether through the natural progression of the disease or triggered by the intensity of combat, the warrior enters what Codex sources describe as a berserker state, a final peak of power in which all the accumulated energy of the transformation is unleashed at once. What happens after this peak is not entirely clear. Some accounts suggest the warrior simply ceases to be present, consumed by whatever force the disease represents. Others suggest something more like a transition, that the warrior does not die in the conventional sense, but moves fully into whatever state they have been approaching throughout the entire period of the contagion. Whether that state is oblivion or something else is not something the lore resolves. The Animus Malorum's capability to resurrect fallen legionaries suggests that death, for these warriors, is not quite as final as it is for everyone else. If a destroyed legionary can be called back, then what the disease's end state does to a legionary who was not destroyed but rather consumed by the final stages of the contagion might be something qualitatively different from simple death. They might still exist somewhere. In the warp, in whatever pocket of reality, between real space and the immaterium that the Legion is theorized to inhabit, waiting, reforming, to be called back when a skull full of consumed souls directs them to. This is deeply strange. It is also, in the context of a setting where chaos gods can rebuild their demonic servants after banishment, where the Necrons can resurrect their fallen warriors through technology, and where the Emperor himself persists in some state between life and death on a golden throne sustained by 10,000 psyker sacrifices a day. Not actually the strangest thing in the lore, but it is strange in a way that feels specifically personal. The Legion of the Damned are not impersonal forces or ancient machines or alien horrors. They were people. They were space marines with names and squads and chapter pride and the specific kind of camaraderie that comes from training and fighting together for years. And whatever they are now carries traces of all that humanity within it, in the care with which they choose their interventions, in the precision with which they avoid causing unnecessary harm to the allied forces they fight alongside, in the simple fact that they are, always and still, fighting for the Imperium that forged them. Section 12. The Inquisition investigates and finds more questions. The Inquisition is the Imperium's watchdog, its secret police, its existential threat assessment agency, and its tribunal all in one. It is staffed by individuals who have survived the kind of career that kills most people many times over, who have seen the worst the galaxy has to offer and kept working anyway, and who are authorized to use whatever methods they find necessary in service of protecting humanity from the threats they identify. The Inquisition hunts demons, heretics, mutants, alien infiltrators, rogue psychers, and any other category of threat to human civilization that other institutions are not equipped to address. The Inquisition has been investigating the Legion of the Damned for a very long time. The results of these investigations, to the limited extent that any of their contents have become accessible to anyone outside the organization's classified archives, suggest that the Legion represents one of the more intellectually humbling problems the Inquisition has ever encountered. Early inquisitorial attention to the Legion appears to have been triggered by the same pattern of impossible appearances and disappearances that drew everyone else's attention. Initial categorization attempts focused on determining whether the Legion was a threat. Were they demons? Were they Chaos Space Marines in disguise? Were they a rogue chapter pursuing its own agenda at the expense of Imperial order? The evidence was frustrating on all fronts. They clearly had warp characteristics. They clearly had warp connections. But they also clearly, consistently, exclusively attacked enemies of the Imperium. And Chaos Space Marines, disguised as loyal Space Marines, do not typically spend centuries appearing in desperate battle situations and tipping the balance in humanity's favor. The Inquisition eventually established what might be called a working position, rather than a definitive conclusion. The Legion of the Damned represents an ongoing investigation, rather than a resolved case. They are monitored. Reports of their appearances are collected and collated. Post-battle analysis is conducted wherever possible. And the conclusions are filed, debated within the appropriate inquisitorial conclaves, and then classified at levels that prevent the kind of broader imperial anxiety that would result from a population knowing that one of the primary sources of miraculous intervention in their deadliest battles is an entity that even the Inquisition cannot categorize. There is a faction within the Inquisition, the more radical elements, who have drawn conclusions about the Legion that the Orthodox membership finds deeply uncomfortable. These radicals look at the Emperor's tarot connection and see the hand of the Emperor himself, directing these beings as instruments of his will in ways that go beyond what the official imperial theology accounts for. The Orthodox view of the Emperor is that he is a godlike figure who maintains the Astronomicon and the throne's various functions through supreme effort, but who does not intervene directly in individual battles or individual decisions. He is present, but not active in the conventional sense. The radicals who study the Legion of the Damned look at the impossible precision of their timing and ask whether that view might need to be revised. Brother Amadeus of the Dark Angels Deathwing, the elite first company that knows secrets about their chapter's history that most Space Marines would find genuinely disturbing, submitted a report on a Legion sighting that noted their behavioral similarities to certain individuals of extreme importance in the Dark Angel's own classified files. He recommended stasis capture and interrogation by interrogator chaplains in full battle plate within a null zone, a field that suppresses psychic activity. His description of their advanced telekinetic capacity, presumably psychic in origin, is one of the more technically specific characterizations in the inquisitorial files, and his instinct to have them questioned by the Dark Angel's own interrogation specialists suggests he saw a connection to whatever the Dark Angels are still hunting 10,000 years after the Horus Heresy, that other chapters are not permitted to know about. Whether any such capture was ever attempted, and if so, what the result was, is not something the publicly accessible records address. The Dark Angels are exceptionally good at keeping secrets. What is clear is that the Inquisition has not resolved the question, has not determined a definitive course of action, and has not managed to significantly increase the amount of hard information available about the Legion despite centuries of active investigation. This is itself data. The Inquisition is very good at finding things out. The Legion of the Damned is very good at remaining unknown. And this asymmetry between the most effective intelligence organization in the Imperium and a group of dead Space Marines that shouldn't still exist is one of the most telling things about what the Legion actually is. Section 13. The Cursed Founding's Other Children, Context and Tragedy. The Firehawks did not suffer their fate in isolation. They are the most extreme case of what the Cursed Founding produced. But they are not the only case, and understanding them in the context of their sibling chapters adds a layer of significance to their story that is easy to miss when you focus on their fate alone. The Lamenter's story has already been mentioned. Their extraordinary engineering, their extraordinary misfortune, their perpetual nearness to extinction, while somehow persisting. What is worth noting is the thematic resonance. The cursed founding produced chapters that were trying to be better than ordinary Space Marines, and the price of that ambition was a shadow that followed them through every subsequent century. The Lamenters were supposed to be free of the Blood Angel's flaw, and instead received a curse of their own. The Firehawks were supposed to be excellent warriors, and ended up becoming something beyond excellent warriors at the cost of everything that made them warriors in a conventional sense. The Flame Falcons spontaneously burst into fire, their bodies literally ignited after great victories, flames that did not burn them but which terrified observers into calling the Inquisition. The Inquisition's response was to send the Grey Knights, and the Grey Knights' response was to nearly destroy them. It is not confirmed what the Flame Falcons had done wrong. They had won a great victory. They were demonstrably loyal. Their body's tendency to catch fire was disturbing, certainly, but they had not used it against the Imperium or its servants. They were destroyed anyway, or mostly destroyed anyway, because the Imperium's institutional response to uncertainty about the nature of something is frequently to eliminate that something and ask questions of the remains. The Firehawks watched the Flame Falcon's fate. There is no record of what they thought about it, but the awareness that their sibling chapter was nearly exterminated for characteristics that were not their fault and that did not make them threats cannot have been irrelevant. Context: when the Firehawks began to discover what the warp was doing to them, they were already part of a founding known for being cursed. They were already well aware of what the Imperium did with chapters it could not categorize. Wiping the chapter markings from their armor and becoming something officially unidentifiable was not merely a practical response to no longer having a functioning chapter identity. It was also, arguably, a survival strategy. There are those who look at the Legion of the Damned and see tragedy, warriors who deserved better, who paid prices they should not have been asked to pay, who have been denied the rest and the recognition that their service merited. This reading is entirely valid and is supported by everything in the lore. The Firehawks lost everything before the warp storm ever happened: their homeworld, their strength, their recognition, their peace. And what the warp storm cost them was the last things they had: their body's integrity, their chapter's future, their ability to live normally in the Imperium they fought for. But there is another reading, not incompatible with the tragic one. The Legion of the Damned, whatever they are now, are not broken. They are not the wreckage of a chapter. They are something that was remade, and what was remade is powerful in ways that the original chapter was not. The Firehawks were excellent warriors. The Legion of the Damned appears where the math says defeat is certain and changes the math. That is a different kind of capability. The tragedy is real. The power is also real. Both of these things can be true. The cursed founding was supposed to create better Space Marines, in the specific and narrow sense that it produced beings capable of things that no ordinary Space Marine can do. The Firehawk's particular curse achieved that goal, not in any way that the Adeptus Mechanicus planned, or that the Imperium officially acknowledges, or that the individuals who became the Legion would have chosen if choosing had been available to them. But the result exists, and it keeps saving lives, and in the grim arithmetic of the 41st Millennium, that has to count for something. Section 14. Legacy: the Ghost in the Galaxy's Machine. The Legion of the Damned has been active in some form for several centuries at minimum, and in some readings of the timeline for much longer. They have intervened in hundreds of documented engagements, and presumably many more that were never formally recorded because nobody who survived had the opportunity or the coherence to file a report. They have fought orcs, Chaos Space Marines, Ildari avatars, Tau battle groups, Tyrannid swarms, demonic entities, and the combined forces of everything the galaxy throws at the Imperium servants in moments of maximum desperation. They have never fought for themselves, never pursued any agenda other than the simple, brutal one that their entire existence is structured around. Find the worst fight, arrive at the worst moment, and make it better. There is something in this that the lore invites you to find meaningful, and resisting that invitation seems like a waste of a genuinely beautiful piece of storytelling. The Legion of the Damned is a story about people who lost everything and kept fighting anyway. Not for glory. They seek no glory. They take no credit. Their interventions are often classified or minimized or explained away by institutions that cannot accommodate them. Not for survival, in any conventional sense. They are already dead in some important ways, already past the point where survival is a meaningful goal. Not for recognition, they receive none. They fight because the Imperium needs someone to fight, and they are available, and this has been enough, apparently, for centuries. There is also something worth acknowledging in how the Imperium itself relates to them. The institution that should, by its own rules and categories, have declared them a threat and sent forces to eliminate them, because they have warp characteristics, because they have unknown origins, because they do not respond to authority or communication, has instead quietly filed reports and classified the data and allowed these beings to keep doing what they do. This is unusually pragmatic for an institution, not generally known for pragmatism. It suggests that somewhere in the decision-making layers of the Imperium, there are people who look at the Legion of the Damned and recognize that whatever they are valuable. That the Imperium cannot afford to spend resources destroying one of the few things in the galaxy that reliably appears when all other options have failed. There is also the cultural weight they carry. Among Space Marines, the Legion of the Damned is spoken of in terms that hover between reverence and something darker. They are a reminder of what the cursed founding cost. They are a reminder of what the warp can do. They are a reminder that loyalty has a price, and that price can be everything, and that paying everything does not necessarily buy you peace or rest, or the clean death that Space Marine culture holds up as the warrior's reward. They are the dark mirror of the honor and glory narrative that Space Marine institutions use to make sense of continuous existence in a galaxy that offers nothing but war. Because the Legion shows you what happens when the glory runs out and the fighting doesn't stop, and you keep going anyway, burned and broken and unable to be categorized as either living or dead, and you just keep showing up where the need is greatest. That's not something that can be neatly filed away. It is not something that chapter culture, with all its ceremonies and honors and halls of remembrance, can fully account for. It sits at the edge of everything the Adeptus Astartes believes about itself and its purpose, and it asks questions that nobody has clean answers to. Are the Legion heroes, given that their sacrifice was greater than anyone else's and their loyalty was never once compromised? Or are they a warning, a demonstration of what not to aspire to, not because they failed, but because they succeeded in continuing to serve at a cost that should have been refused? The answer is probably both, which is characteristic of the best storytelling in the 40th millennium. This is a setting that rarely lets you have simple readings. It gives you the honor and the horror together, the glory and the grief braided together so tightly that separating them is impossible, and asks you to sit with that complexity rather than resolving it into something cleaner. The bell of lost souls tolled for the Firehawks. 1,000 strikes for 1,000 fallen brothers. But the brothers are not gone. Not completely, not in any simple sense. Something that carries their purpose still moves through the galaxy, still appears in the darkness when the darkness is deepest, still fights for an Imperium that has classified its existence and moved on. If there is a word for what they are, between loss and persistence, between death and something that is not quite its opposite, it might be something like haunting. They haunt the Imperium they served. They haunt the battles they appear in, the commanders who survive because of them, the scholars who try to categorize them, the theologians who try to explain them. They are the ghost in the galaxy's machine, the reminder that in the grim darkness of the far future, even the damned will keep fighting for something they believe in. In the end, perhaps that is enough. In a galaxy where hope is rationed and victory is temporary and the war never ends, something that keeps showing up anyway, silent and burning and utterly committed, might be the closest thing to a promise that this universe can make. Section 15, the ongoing mystery, what the lore leaves open. One of the genuinely admirable things about how the Legion of the Damned has been handled as a piece of lore is the discipline with which the mystery has been maintained. Games Workshop has had decades and multiple editions of the game to resolve the questions around the Legion's nature. They have not done so. The 6th edition Codex presented the most detailed examination of the subject and deliberately left every major question open. The 8th edition rulebook included the Legion in its lore sections without resolving the contradictions. They remain, in the current state of the hobby, as mysterious as they have ever been. This is not laziness. A lazy approach would have simply picked the Firehawks theory and moved on, which would have been perfectly serviceable and much easier. Instead, the approach taken has been to lean into the ambiguity, to add new theories and new eyewitness accounts that complicate the picture further rather than clarifying it, and to maintain the Legion's mystery as an active and deliberate feature of their identity. The result is a faction that functions differently in the imagination than almost anything else in the hobby. Most factions in Warhammer 40,000 can be exhaustively described. You can tell someone everything there is to know about the Ultramarines, or the Necrons, or the Tau, or the Tyranids, and that description will be complete in a meaningful sense. You cannot do this with the Legion of the Damned. Any description of them is necessarily provisional, shot through, with qualifiers and alternative possibilities, and the fundamental acknowledgement that the smartest people in the setting who have tried to answer these questions definitively have all failed. This makes them feel real in a particular way. The Imperium of Man is enormous, old, and full of things that the institutions governing it do not fully understand. The idea that there is something out there that cannot be categorized, cannot be contacted, cannot be controlled, but that shows up when needed, and fights in ways that suggest a loyalty deeper than anything the institutions themselves have been able to generate. That feels true to the texture of the setting in a way that a clean answer would not. The timeline contradictions have never been resolved, and probably should not be. The warp is not subject to linear time. If you accept the Firehawks theory, you also have to accept that the warp storm did something to them that goes beyond the physical, something that allowed them, or something connected to them, to operate in temporal patterns that precede their own creation in real space terms. This is disturbing to think about carefully, but entirely consistent with what the warp is described as doing to other things in the lore. Time is not a constraint. The Immaterium respects. The question of their numbers is also unresolved. Are there still 200 of them, the original survivors whittled down further by decades of combat? Are there thousands, recruits added through the Animus Malorum's soul binding across centuries? Are the numbers meaningless because whatever they are can expand and contract based on the warp's provision rather than biological limitations? Nobody knows. There are accounts that describe large formations and accounts that describe handfuls. Whether this represents variation in deployment size, variation in capability to manifest in real space, or simply the inconsistency natural to battlefield reports from highly stressed witnesses, is unclear. What is clear is that they will keep appearing. The Imperium will keep facing situations where defeat seems mathematically inevitable. And in those situations, there is a possibility, not a certainty, not something you can plan for, but a possibility that something will appear from the dark, painted black, and wrapped in pale fire, and make the impossible slightly less so. That possibility is, in the context of what the 41st Millennium actually looks like to live through, something very close to hope. Closing the damned and the duty that never ends. Before the closing, let us spend a moment with what the miniatures themselves represent in the hobby, because the physical objects, the models, are part of how this story has been told across the decades of Warhammer 40,000's existence, and they deserve acknowledgement. The first published rules for the Legion of the Damned appeared in 1988's White Dwarf issue 99 in an article by Rick Priestley, one of the foundational figures in the game's creation. This was the Rogue Trader era, the first edition, when Warhammer 40,000 was rawer and stranger, and more willing to let its concepts be explicitly weird. Priestley identified them directly as the Firehawks chapter, not as a mystery, but as a statement. That directness was later softened into ambiguity, which is one of the few cases where the softening genuinely improved the concept. In the second edition, they appeared in Codex Ultramarines, the closest thing to a general Space Marine codex that edition had, and that is where the story of Tigurius and the battle at Andraxis first entered the published record. The special character Sergeant Attica Centurius and the Animus Malorum were introduced in White Dwarf during this same period, giving the Legion their most identifiable individual and their most extraordinary artifact in the same breath. The miniatures produced for the Legion over the years have consistently done justice to the lore they represent. The models carry all the detail described in the text: black armor, intricate bone etchings, skeletal hands, and rib cages rendered in careful relief across every surface. The helmet designs communicate the skull imagery without being crude about it. And the way the fire is incorporated into the sculpts, not just painted on, but part of the physical form of certain models, emerging from greaves and shoulder plates in three-dimensional relief, communicates something about what the warp fire means to these warriors. It is not decoration, it is part of them. It has been for a very long time. The 6th edition saw the Legion receive their own dedicated codex, digital at release, an unusual distinction for a force that was not at the time a full standalone army. That codex remains one of the best single-volume treatments of any faction in the game's history, precisely because of what it chose not to do. It could have answered the questions. It answered none of them. It instead assembled all the competing theories, presented them with appropriate scholarly distance, and gave the reader the intellectual tools to think about the mystery without resolving it. That is excellent writing, and it is the reason the Legion has maintained the imaginative grip they have across multiple editions of the game since. In the age of Warhammer 40,000's current 10th edition, the Legion of the Damned has lost some of the specific mechanical representation they had in earlier editions. They are not currently a standalone force with their own codex and army rules in the way they were during the 6th and 7th editions, but their lore presence has not diminished. They appear in novels, in rulebooks, in the broader sweep of the narrative across the setting. They cannot be scheduled, they cannot be reliably deployed in the conventional military planning sense. And in the same way that you cannot reliably deploy them on the tabletop anymore, you cannot predict when the lore will bring them back to center stage. They will appear when the story needs them. They always do. There are moments in the lore of Warhammer 40,000 where the setting's darkness is not simply oppressive but genuinely moving, where the grimdark aesthetic stops being about how terrible everything is and starts being about something harder to articulate, the way that people and space marines and whatever the Legion of the Damned are keep carrying their purposes forward, even when carrying them costs more than carrying should cost. The Legion of the Damned is one of those moments, sustained across decades of storytelling. Think about what it means to be remembered badly. Not to be forgotten, that is one kind of loss, but to have the thing that should have been your legacy reduced to a single line in an administrative record. The bell of lost souls tolled for the Firehawks. A black candle was lit. The chapter was declared dead. And that, officially, was that. The Imperium moved on, as it always does, because it is too large and too embattled and too ancient to stop moving for any individual loss, no matter how significant. The Firehawks received no monument, no hall of remembrance in the Ultramarines' fortress that they might have had a claim on as kin, if the Ultramarines had ever acknowledged the kinship. No chapter chapel preserved on a world that survived their passing, because both their homeworlds were gone. No proper archive of their combat record on Terra, because when a chapter is declared dead in the warp, the administrative apparatus that should have maintained those records often quietly reprioritizes. They were honored in the ritual sense, the bell, the candle, the formal declaration, and then they were set aside. What followed is the strangest posthumous record in the history of the Adeptus Astartes. A chapter declared dead keeps appearing in battle reports. Not under their old name, they shed that name with the heraldry, but recognizably, clearly, documented across centuries, still fighting, still loyal, still showing up for a Imperium that wrote them off and moved on. There is a particular kind of courage in continuing after being officially forgotten, not the courage of the witness, which is sustained by the knowledge that someone is watching and recording and will remember. The courage of the invisible, the courage of doing the work when the work is not going to be acknowledged or rewarded or even properly recorded. That is what the Legion of the Damned demonstrates, across every documented appearance, across every battle where the odds were wrong and the outcome was changed, across every moment where the Imperium servants were alone with their deaths and then were not. They lost their home before they ever had a stable one. They lost their Primarch's acknowledgement. If the Ultramarines ever acknowledged them as kin, the record does not show it. They lost their homeworld twice. They came back from the Badab War diminished and unrewarded. And then they lost the warp jump, and the fleet, and most of their brothers, and their gene seed, and eventually the capacity to be conventionally alive. And they kept fighting. Not because the Imperium demanded it, the Imperium declared them dead and moved on. Not because anyone was watching, or rewarding, or recording. Because they were still Space Marines, at whatever depth of being that description reaches, and Space Marines fight. The Firehawks were the most cursed products of the most cursed founding in Space Marine history. They deserve to be remembered not simply as a footnote to the Legion of the Damned story, but as a chapter in their own right, fierce, loyal, unlucky, and ultimately more than their disasters. The warriors who survived the warp storm and chose to keep fighting, rather than simply waiting to die with whatever speed the contagion would allow them, those warriors made a choice that defines the Legion as much as anything that happened to them. Tragedy is what the universe did to them. What they did in response to tragedy is what they are. The Legion of the Damned haunts the 41st millennium the way all the best ghost stories work. Not by being scary in a cheap sense, but by being present, by showing up again and again in the moments when presence matters most, by being the silent answer to prayers that nobody believed would be answered, by demonstrating, in the most extreme possible circumstances, that loyalty and purpose can outlast everything that tries to end them. Somewhere out there, in the vast dark of the galaxy, in the spaces between real space and the immaterium, in whatever state of existence the warp contagion has produced, they wait. The Emperor's tarot turns. A battle somewhere is going wrong. The math turns negative, and the Legion of the Damned arrives. They always do. Thank you for spending this much time with one of the most haunting and genuinely mysterious corners of the 40,000 universe. If you made it this far, you clearly care about the lore the way it deserves to be cared about deeply, slowly, with attention to the details that make it feel like more than just a game setting. Hit that like button if this was worth your time, and subscribe if you want more of this kind of deep narrative dive into the lore that makes this universe so extraordinary. There is so much more to explore. The galaxy is large, the darkness is deep, and we have barely scratched the surface of what lives in both. Stay safe out there, and remember, if the fighting ever looks completely hopeless, look to the edges of the battlefield. Sometimes, something comes out of the dark. The galaxy is dark, and the war never ends, and the light the Emperor casts from his golden prison is faint across a million worlds. But somewhere in the space between the stars and the nightmares, black armor catches no light and pale fire burns without heat, and they are still there, still moving, still choosing, over and over, across every awakening and every battle, the same thing they chose the first time, to keep going, to be present, to be the thing that shows up when nothing else can. In a universe defined by the slow, grinding victory of entropy and corruption and despair, that choice is not nothing. It might be the most important thing. Wherever they go when the battle ends, whatever state they return to between interventions, whatever the warp has made of the men who once called themselves Firehawks, they keep that choice with them. They keep the loyalty. They keep the purpose. They keep showing up. And that, in the end, is the story of the Legion of the Damned. Not a story about death, though it is full of death. Not a story about loss, though loss is in every line of it. A story about what remains when everything else is taken. A story about the stubbornness of purpose in the face of every possible reason to abandon it. The bell tolled for them. The candle burned for them. They never stopped burning themselves.